The dressing room door is still open. The hallway outside is buzzing with crew members coiling cables, roadies moving cases, musicians toweling off sweat and adrenaline from the stage they just left. Inside, Jackson Browne sits on a worn leather couch, his shirt damp at the collar, his hands resting on his knees. He's staring at the floor. Not because he's tired, because he knows what's coming. Don Henley hasn't arrived yet, but he will. They've been in the same building a dozen times over the past 5 years. Same festivals, same benefit concerts, same industry gatherings where everyone pretends the past doesn't exist, and every time, they've moved through those spaces like magnets reversed. Close enough to feel the push, far enough to never collide. Tonight is different. Someone made a mistake, or maybe it wasn't a mistake. Maybe someone thought enough time had passed. Maybe they thought two men in their 30s, both successful, both respected, could share a backstage area for one night without the air turning to glass. Jackson exhales slowly. He hears footsteps in the hallway. He doesn't look up. The door swings wider. Don Henley steps inside, still wearing his stage clothes, his face unreadable. He stops when he sees Jackson. For a moment, neither of them moves. The noise from the hallway feels very far away. "Didn't know you were in here," Don says. His voice is flat. "Yeah," Jackson says quietly. "Me neither." There's a long pause. Don doesn't leave. Jackson doesn't stand. The room is small enough that they can't pretend the other isn't there, and both of them are too tired, or too proud, or too something else to walk out. This isn't the first time they've been in the same room since it all fell apart. But it's the first time they've been alone. It started years earlier in a different kind of room. A living room in Laurel Canyon, windows open, late afternoon light pouring in over hardwood floors and half-empty wine glasses. The kind of place where songwriters gathered, where melodies got passed around like cigarettes, where collaboration felt like breathing. Jackson and Don had known each other for years by then. They weren't best friends. But they were part of the same circle, the same late-night writing sessions, the same arguments about chord progressions and lyric phrasing, the same unspoken understanding that music mattered more than ego, or so it seemed. They had worked together before. Harmonies on a track here, a co-write there. Nothing heavy, nothing that required too much vulnerability. But there was respect. And respect in that world was harder to earn than fame. Then came the song. It wasn't planned. Most good things aren't. Jackson had been working on something for weeks, a melody that wouldn't let go. Lyrics that felt close, but not close enough. He played it for a few people. Don was one of them. Don listened, didn't say much at first. Then he picked up a guitar and started adding a line, a harmony, a suggestion for the bridge. Jackson played it back. It worked. They kept going. 3 hours later, they had something. Something neither of them could have written alone. They didn't talk about credit. They didn't talk about who contributed what. It felt equal. It felt clean. And for a while, it was. The song got recorded. It got released. It got attention. More attention than either of them expected. Radio play. Chart movement. The kind of success that opens doors and closes others. That's when the questions started. Whose song is it? Who wrote the hook? Who came up with the chorus? At first the answers were vague, collaborative effort. Both of us. You know how it goes. But the questions kept coming, and at some point, the answers started to shift. Jackson heard through a friend that Don had been telling people the song was mostly his. That Jackson had contributed, sure, but the core of it, the heart of it, came from Don's side of the room. Jackson didn't believe it at first. Then he heard it again, from someone else. Then he read it in an interview. He didn't call, he didn't confront. He just stopped answering when Don reached out. Don noticed. Of course he noticed. He started hearing things too. That Jackson was bitter, that Jackson felt cheated, that Jackson was telling his own version where Don had taken credit for work he didn't do. Neither version was entirely true. Neither version was entirely false. What was true, both of them believed they'd been wronged. Both of them felt disrespected. And both of them were too proud or too hurt or too afraid of looking weak to pick up the phone and ask what the hell happened. So they didn't. Months turned into a year, the year turned into 2, then 5, then 10. The silence became its own entity. It had weight, it had presence. It sat between them at industry events, in the space between their names on festival lineups, in the careful way mutual friends learned not to mention one to the other. Jackson tried to forget about it. He wrote other songs, better songs, he told himself. He toured. He built a career that didn't need Don Henley's name attached to it. He dated. He fell in love. He had his heart broken. He kept moving because moving was easier than standing still and remembering what it felt like to lose a friendship over something as stupid as pride. But late at night, when the house was quiet and the guitar sat in the corner and the walls pressed in with their emptiness, he thought about it. He thought about the afternoon they wrote that song, how easy it had been, how natural, how Don had laughed at something Jackson said, and they'd turned that laugh into a lyric, and for 3 perfect hours, the world outside that room didn't exist. He thought about calling. He even picked up the phone once, dialed 6 of the 7 digits, then put it down. What would he even say? Hey, remember that thing we never talked about? Want to talk about it now? It felt impossible. It felt childish. So he let it go, or he tried to. Don did the same thing. He told himself it didn't matter, that Jackson was overreacting, that the whole thing had been blown out of proportion by people who didn't understand how collaboration worked. But he remembered the look on Jackson's face the last time they'd been in the same room before everything went cold. They'd been at a party, someone's birthday. Don had walked in, seen Jackson across the room, raised a hand in greeting. Jackson had looked right at him, right through him, and then turned away. That moment lived in Don's chest like a bruise. He poked at it sometimes, testing to see if it still hurt. It always did. He wanted to be angry. He wanted to believe Jackson was petty, jealous, unable to handle success. But the truth he wouldn't say out loud, was that he knew he'd messed up. He knew the interviews had gotten away from him. He knew he'd let people believe a version of events that made him look better and Jackson look smaller. He told himself it was an accident, that he'd been caught off guard by the questions, that he'd answered honestly based on what he remembered. But memory is a funny thing. It bends. It shifts. It protects you from the parts of yourself you don't want to see. And maybe, just maybe, Don had needed to believe he was more responsible for that song than he actually was. Because the Eagles were taking off, and the pressure was enormous, and he needed to prove to himself and to the world that he belonged. But that didn't make it right. He thought about reaching out. He composed letters in his head, apologies that sounded hollow even in his imagination. He saw Jackson's name in magazines on album covers, heard his voice on the radio, and every time there was a small tug in his chest. Regret, maybe. Or just the echo of something that used to matter. Years passed. The silence became normal. People stopped asking. Or maybe they just learned that neither Jackson nor Don would answer. And then came tonight. Don stands near the door, one hand still on the frame, like he might leave at any second. Jackson stays on the couch, his head tilted slightly, watching Don without meeting his eyes. "You sounded good out there," Jackson says. His voice is low, careful. Don doesn't respond right away. He shifts his weight. His jaw tightens, then loosens. "You too," he says finally. Another silence. This one heavier. Jackson rubs his palms together, slow, deliberate. "We can keep doing this, you know. Keep walking past each other. Keep pretending it's fine." Don's eyes flick toward him. "I'm not pretending anything. Neither am I." The air between them pulls tight. "You think I took something from you," Don says. "It's not a question." Jackson looks up now. His face is calm, but there's something underneath. Something that's been sitting in his chest for years. I think you let people believe something that wasn't true, Jackson says, and you didn't correct it. Don's expression hardens. You think I lied? I think you didn't tell the whole story. Don steps further into the room now. The door swings shut behind him. The noise from the hallway cuts off. It's just the two of them. I told the story I remember, Don says. His voice is sharper now, but not loud. You think your version is the only one that matters? Jackson stands, not fast, not aggressive, just tired of sitting. I think we both wrote that song, he says, and I think somewhere along the way you started believing you wrote more of it than you did. Don's face flushes. That's bullshit. Is it? They're standing 6 feet apart, close enough to feel the heat, far enough to still have space to choose. You never said anything, Don says, his voice tight. Not once, you just disappeared. You let me think you were fine, and then I find out years later you've been carrying this around like I stabbed you in the back. I didn't know how to say it, Jackson says quietly. I didn't know if it would even matter. So you just wrote me off? You wrote yourself off, Jackson says. The second you started taking credit I didn't give you. Don looks away. His hand goes to the back of his neck, presses hard. When he speaks again, his voice is lower. I didn't mean for it to go that way. Jackson doesn't move, doesn't speak, just waits. I didn't mean to, Don says again, quieter this time. I got asked about it over and over, and I didn't know what to say, so I said what I remembered. And maybe I remembered it wrong. Or maybe I remembered it the way I needed to. There's a crack in his voice now, small but real. I needed to believe I could do it, Don says, that I could write something that mattered, that I wasn't just riding on someone else's coattails. Jackson's face softens, just a little, just enough. You didn't need to take it from me to prove that, he says. Don's shoulders drop. He looks at Jackson now, really looks at him, and for the first time in years there's no wall between them. Just two men who used to make music together, who used to trust each other, who lost something they didn't know how to name. I'm sorry, Don says. His voice barely carries. I'm sorry I let it get this far. Jackson nods, slow. He doesn't smile, doesn't rush to fill the space with forgiveness or relief. He just lets the words sit. I could have called you, Jackson says after a moment. I could have said something before it turned into this. Yeah, Don says. You could have. They stand there. The room feels smaller now. Not suffocating, just close. There's a long stretch of quiet. Outside, someone laughs. A door slams. The world keeps moving, indifferent to what's happening in this small room with its peeling paint and flickering overhead light. Do you remember the day we wrote it? Jackson asks. His voice is softer now, almost tentative. Don's eyes shift. He does remember. Of course he does. Yeah, he says. I remember. You brought that 12-string, Jackson says. The one with the crack in the back. Still have it, Don says. We were supposed to be working on something else, Jackson continues. Some demo for a friend. But you started playing that riff and I couldn't let it go. Don nods slowly. You had the first verse already. You sang it once and I knew it was going to be something. We stayed until the sun went down, Jackson says. Missed dinner. Didn't care. We thought we were invincible, Don says quietly. We were kids, Jackson says. We were idiots, Don adds. Jackson almost smiles. Almost. When did it stop feeling like that? Jackson asks. When did it stop being about the music? Don exhales long and slow. I don't know, somewhere between the contract, negotiations, and the tour schedules and the people telling us what we were supposed to be. The Eagles took off, Jackson says. It's not an accusation, just a fact. Yeah, Don says, they did. And suddenly everyone wanted a piece. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone needed me to be something I wasn't sure I could be. So you held on to that song, Jackson says. Like proof. Don's jaw works. Maybe I did. Jackson sits back down on the couch. Don hesitates, then moves to the chair across from him. They're facing each other now, no barriers, no escape routes. I was scared too, Jackson says, after it happened. After I heard what you were saying, I was terrified that maybe you were right. That maybe I didn't contribute as much as I thought, that maybe my memory was the one that was wrong. Don looks surprised. You? You were scared? All the time, Jackson says. Still am, most days. You never show it, Don says. Neither do you, Jackson replies. They sit with that for a moment. Two men who built careers on appearing confident, on projecting certainty, admitting that underneath it all, they're just as lost as everyone else. I wanted to call you, Don says. 100 times. More. Why didn't you? Jackson asks. Same reason you didn't call me, Don says. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know if sorry would be enough. It's a start, Jackson says. Don leans forward, elbows on his knees. I don't know how to undo 40 years. We don't have to undo it, Jackson says. We just have to decide if we want to keep carrying it. The words hang in the air, heavy, true. I'm tired, Don says. I'm tired of pretending it doesn't bother me. I'm tired of seeing your name and feeling like I owe you something I can never pay back. You don't owe me anything, Jackson says. I just wanted you to see me, to acknowledge that I was there too. I see you, Don says. His voice cracks. I've always seen you. Jackson's throat tightens. He looks down at his hands, at the calluses from years of guitar strings, at the lines that appeared when he wasn't looking. The song still means something to me, Jackson says quietly. Not because of the success, not because of what it did for my career, because of that afternoon, because it was the first time I felt like I really understood what collaboration could be. Me too, Don says. That's why I held on to it so hard. That's why I couldn't let it be anything less than mine. But it was ours, Jackson says, looking up now. That's what made it good. Don's eyes are wet. He doesn't wipe them. He just sits there, letting the weight of 4 decades press down on his shoulders, letting it finally crack and fall away. I don't know if we can go back, Don says. I don't want to go back, Jackson says. I just want to stop running away. Don nods, once, twice, like he's trying to convince himself. I don't know how to fix this, Don says. I don't either, Jackson says. But maybe we don't have to fix it all at once. They sit in the quiet. It's not comfortable, it's not easy, but it's honest. After a long moment, Don stands. He walks to the small window in the corner of the room, looks out at the parking lot where buses and trucks sit waiting to move on to the next city, the next show, the next temporary home. You still write every day? Don asks, his back still turned. Every day, Jackson says. Good songs? Some, Jackson says. Some terrible ones, too. Don laughs. It's quiet, but it's real. Yeah, me too. He turns around, leans against the wall. We were good together, weren't we? We were, Jackson says. Think we could be again? Don asks. His voice is uncertain, like a question he's afraid to hear the answer to. Jackson doesn't answer right away. He thinks about the years, the silence, the hurt that burrowed so deep he forgot it was there until moments like this, when it surfaces and reminds him that some wounds never fully heal. But he also thinks about the music, the way their voices used to blend, the way Don could hear a melody in his head and pull it out into the world, the way they used to finish each other's lines, musically and otherwise. I don't know, Jackson says honestly, but I'd like to find out. Don's face shifts. Relief, maybe, or hope, or just exhaustion finally giving way to something softer. Next time I'm in L.A., Don says, maybe I'll call, maybe I'll answer, Jackson says. Don nods. He moves toward the door, his hand on the handle. He stops. Jackson, he says, yeah? Thank you, Don says, for not walking out. Jackson meets his eyes. "Thank you for not making me." Don opens the door. The noise from the hallway rushes back in. The world, loud and demanding, waiting for them to step back into it. But before he leaves, Don turns one more time. "That song," he says, "it was ours. I'm going to start saying that, if anyone asks." Jackson's chest tightens. He nods. "Yeah, it was ours." Don leaves. The door clicks shut. Jackson sits alone in the dressing room, his hands still resting on his knees, staring at the place where Don was standing. The weight is still there. The years don't disappear just because two men decided to talk. The hurt doesn't vanish just because apologies were spoken. But something shifted. Something cracked open, just enough to let light through. Outside, the crew is still packing up. Musicians are still laughing, still swapping stories, still living in the moment they just gave to a crowd that will forget most of it by morning. But inside that dressing room, something changed. Something neither of them will talk about in interviews. Something that won't make headlines or end up in liner notes. A silence broke. Not with thunder, not with triumph, just with two men deciding for one night to stop pretending the past didn't hurt. And maybe that's all reconciliation ever is, not a grand gesture, not a public apology, just a door that stays open a little longer than it did before, just a voice that says, "I see you, I remember, and I'm still here." Jackson stands up slowly. He walks to the mirror on the wall, looks at his reflection. The face staring back is older than the one he remembers from that afternoon in Laurel Canyon. More lines, more gray. More proof that time doesn't stop just because you wish it would. But the eyes are the same, still searching, still hoping, still believing that music matters more than the mess it sometimes creates. He picks up his guitar from the corner of the room, sits back down, starts playing softly. Not the song, not the one that caused all this. Something new, something that doesn't have a name yet. His fingers move over the strings, finding chords, building a melody. And for the first time in a long time, he doesn't feel the absence of what he lost. He feels the possibility of what he might still find. Down the hallway, in another dressing room, Don Henley sits in the same kind of quiet. His guitar rests against his leg. He's not playing it, just holding it, feeling the weight of it, the familiarity. He thinks about Jackson, about the way his voice sounded tonight, calm, honest, forgiving without needing to forgive. He thinks about the years they lost, the music they could have made, the friendship that fell apart because neither of them knew how to hold it together. And he thinks about tomorrow, and the day after that, and the hundreds of days stretching out ahead, each one an opportunity to do something different than they did before. He picks up his phone, stares at it, puts it down. Not tonight. Tonight was enough. But soon. Maybe soon. Years later, people will still ask, what happened between Jackson Browne and Don Henley? Why did they stop working together? Why did they stop talking? And the answers will still be vague. Collaborative differences, creative paths diverging, the usual industry language that means everything and nothing. But those who were there that night, those who saw Don walk out of that dressing room with his face softer than it was when he walked in, those who saw Jackson sit alone for a long time afterward staring at nothing, breathing slow and steady, they'll know. They'll know that two men who built something beautiful together and then watched it turn ugly, found a way to stand in the same room without burning it down. They'll know that pride and pain can live in the same chest for decades, that silence can become a language all its own, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is not to defend yourself, but to listen to someone else try to defend theirs. They'll know that Don Henley didn't walk into that room looking for a fight, and Jackson Browne didn't stay in it to win one. They walked in as strangers who used to be friends, and they walked out as two men who maybe, someday, could be something like that again. The song still exists. It still gets played. People still argue about who wrote what, who deserves credit, who mattered more. But in that dressing room, on that one night, none of that mattered. What mattered was the look in Don's eyes when he said, "I didn't mean for it to go that way." What mattered was the steadiness in Jackson's voice when he said, "I could have called you." What mattered was the space they gave each other to be wrong, to be hurt, to be human. And when the door finally closed, and the hallway emptied, and the lights in the venue went dark, the only thing left was the truth they both already knew. That forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It just makes room for what comes next. That reconciliation doesn't mean forgetting. It means remembering together, with all the pain and beauty that entails. That sometimes the longest journey isn't across the country or around the world. Sometimes it's just across a room, 6 feet of space that feels like 6,000 miles, and the courage it takes to cross that distance, to say I'm sorry, to say I see you, to say I'm still here, that courage is worth more than any song ever written. Jackson closes his eyes, his fingers still moving over the guitar strings. The melody is taking shape now, something slow, something honest, and somewhere down the hall Don Henley hears it, faint, distant, but unmistakable. He closes his eyes too, and listens.